One small touch while cooking, and Linda realizes she's starting to fall for CEO Quang. Will she let him stay? Hi everyone, hope you're having a wonderful day. Today we're going to explore the sweet, early sparks between Linda and CEO Quang as they care for the bamboo rats, feed the chickens, and cook side by side in Linda's tiny mountain home, where every warm gesture feels like a quiet confession. If you enjoy the story, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next episodes. The mountain morning bit through everything: wood, skin, even breath. Fog rolled over Linda's tiny house like a heavy blanket, swallowing the path behind it. In the quiet yard, the only sound was straw shifting inside a bamboo cage. Linda crouched beside the cage, her fingers careful and gentle as she replaced the bedding. "Easy. Don't be scared," she whispered to the bamboo rat inside. Its whiskers twitched. It sniffed the air, then settled. A faint crunch came from the fence line. Linda froze. Not fear. Something sharper. She stood slowly and turned toward the sound. A tall figure stepped through the fog. CEO Quang. He carried a cloth bag slung over one shoulder and two wooden slats in his hand. His hair was slightly damp from the mist, his expression calm, like this was normal, like he hadn't climbed a mountain just to show up at her door. "You're up early," he said. Linda blinked, caught between surprise and embarrassment. "Why are you here?" Quang lifted the bag a little. "Feed, and a few things you might need." His eyes flicked to the cage. "I heard you're raising a picky little boss." Linda tried to sound firm. "He's not a boss." Quang crouched beside her anyway, close enough that she could feel his presence warming the cold air between them. He studied the cage latch with the focus of someone who solved problems for a living. "This latch is loose," he murmured. "If he pushes at night, he'll get out." "I tied it with rope," Linda said, defensive. "Rope loosens." Quang glanced at her hands, thin, slightly rough, the kind of hands that had learned to do everything alone. "You shouldn't have to wake up scared because of a knot." Linda swallowed. She hated how easily he saw things. Quang slid one wooden slat under the latch, testing. He reached for the wire from his bag, twisting it with quick, practiced movements. Then his hand jerked. A sharp scrape. A thin line of red appeared across his knuckle. Linda's breath caught. "You're bleeding." "It's nothing," Quang said automatically, pulling his hand back. Linda grabbed his wrist, lightly but firmly. "Stop saying nothing." She hurried to the porch and pulled out a small tin box. It wasn't fancy. Just the kind of box someone kept when they had no one else to rely on. She came back, crushed a dried leaf between her fingers and pressed it to his cut. Quang watched her quietly. "You keep medicine like you're always expecting pain." Linda didn't answer. She wrapped cloth around his finger, tying it tight. "It stings," he said, half teasing. "Good," she muttered. "Then you'll remember to be careful." Quang's laugh was soft, almost fond. So strict. Linda finally looked up. Their faces were close. Too close. She could see the faint tiredness in his eyes, like sleep didn't come easily to him either. For 1 second the fog, the cold, the cage, the whole world disappeared. Linda pulled her hand away too quickly. "The Dewey gets scared if you talk loud." Quang lowered his voice immediately. "Like this?" Her ears burned. "Yes." Quang leaned toward the cage, speaking like he was negotiating with a tiny king. "Listen, I'm not here to steal your home. I'm just helping your friend." Linda snapped. "He's not my friend." Quang's eyes lifted to hers. A small smile appeared. "Then what am I?" Linda's throat tightened. She looked away and pretended to fix the straw again. Quang didn't push. He placed the bag down and quietly laid out the items he'd brought: a small sack of feed, wire, and a thick cloth that could block wind from gaps in the wall. "You didn't have to bring all this," Linda said. Quang shrugged. "I wanted to." That sentence hit harder than any dramatic confession, because it didn't sound like pity. It sounded like choice. For a while they worked in silence. Quang strengthened the latch and reinforced the corners. Linda checked the water bowl and smoothed the straw. Their hands brushed once. Brief, accidental. But it made Linda's heartbeat stumble. Quang's voice softened. "Do you always do everything alone up here?" Linda kept her eyes down. "It's easier." "Easier," he repeated, tasting the word. "Or lonelier?" Linda didn't answer. She stood and walked toward the backyard like the cold air could help her breathe again. "The chickens," she said, forcing her tone to sound normal. "They'll be hungry." Quang followed without arguing. Behind the house, the yard opened into a narrow strip of earth and grass. Chickens scratched at the ground, feathers puffed against the cold. Linda scooped grain and called softly. "Come. Come here." The flock rushed toward her instantly, clucking and crowding around her feet as if she were the only warmth they trusted. Quang watched, impressed. "They listen to you." "They don't listen," Linda said. "They just know I feed them." Quang's eyes stayed on her face. "That's still trust." A chicken darted past and pecked at Quang's shoe. He jumped back, offended. "Hey!" Linda burst into a laugh before she could stop it. Bright, light, real. Quang froze, staring like he'd just heard music. "You laugh." Linda's smile faded quickly. "It was stupid." "No," Quang said quietly. "It's nice." Linda looked away, suddenly shy. "They're just chickens." "And you're not just anything," he replied. The wind rose. Linda shivered. Quang didn't hesitate. He shrugged off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. Linda's eyes widened. "No, CEO Quang." "Don't call me that here," he interrupted softly. "It makes you feel far from me." Linda went still. Quang adjusted the jacket so it covered her properly. Careful, respectful, never forcing. "You'll freeze." "You'll get cold," Linda whispered. Quang met her gaze. "I can handle cold." Then, softer. So soft it felt like it wasn't meant to be heard. "I can't handle you being cold." Linda's lips parted, but no words came out. Her fingers clutched the edge of the jacket like she was afraid the warmth would disappear. She tried to recover. "You should go back down before it gets dark." Quang didn't move. "And leave you alone again?" "I'm used to it," Linda said, too fast. Quang looked past her toward the foggy path behind the fence, then back at her, voice firm but gentle. "Being used to something doesn't make it right." Linda's chest tightened. She didn't know how to accept care without feeling like a burden, so she chose the safest thing she could offer. "If you're not leaving yet," she murmured, "I can make something to eat." Quang's expression softened immediately. "I'll help." "You cook?" Linda asked, skeptical. Quang smiled. "I can learn." They turned toward the porch together. And then, a sudden burst of chicken cries exploded behind them. Sharp, panicked. The flock scattered like something had rushed through the yard. Linda spun around. Her stomach dropped. Quang stepped in front of her without thinking, his body shielding hers. His eyes narrowed toward the fence line where the fog was thickest. "Stay here," he said, low and controlled. Linda's fingers tightened on his jacket. "What is it?" Quang didn't answer right away. Because beyond the fence, somewhere on the hidden path, there was a slow, deliberate sound. A crunch. A footstep. And it wasn't theirs. Quang stayed in front of Linda, eyes fixed on the fence where the fog was thickest. The chickens had scattered into the corners of the yard, heads jerking at every sound. Another crunch, soft, deliberate, came from the hidden path. Quang didn't rush into the fog. He crouched, pressed 2 fingers into the wet soil, and studied a fresh mark near the fence line. New. He rose and turned back to Linda. His voice was low and steady. Go inside, lock the door. Linda tightened her grip on his jacket. What if it's a person? Quang's jaw flexed once. Then we don't give them a reason to come closer. He walked the fence, scanning bushes, listening. The fog swallowed everything beyond 3 meters. After a long beat, the yard went quiet again. Quang returned to the porch and stepped inside with Linda. He slid the wooden bolt into place himself. Linda's hands trembled. Did you see anything? No, Quang said. Then. But someone was close. The bamboo rat scratched inside its cage, unsettled. Linda crouched. Shh. It's okay. Quang watched her. You calm everyone, he said quietly. Except yourself. Linda swallowed and stood. I promised food. Quang nodded. Tell me what to do. The kitchen was small, 1 stove, 1 table. Linda washed vegetables while Quang rolled up his sleeves and tried to light the firewood. Smoke rushed into his face. He coughed. Linda turned too fast and bumped the table. Stop blowing like that, you'll make it worse. Quang tried again. Still smoke. Linda laughed, quick and bright. Quang froze, then smiled. There it is again. Linda's smile vanished. Focus. I am, he said. Rule 1 up here. Listen to Linda. She rolled her eyes, cheeks warm. She stepped behind him, adjusted the wood, and guided the flame until it caught clean. Quang went still. Linda pulled back quickly. Now it won't smoke. Quang glanced at her. You're good at fixing things. I have to be, she replied. He took the knife and began slicing ginger the way she showed him. Careful, precise. Linda watched his fingers. Not like that. You'll cut yourself. She reached in, repositioned his grip, and held his hand for half a second too long. Quang's voice dropped. If I cut myself again, will you scold me? Yes, Linda said too fast. And treat it? Linda looked away. Just cut the ginger. The pot began to steam. The room filled with ginger and herbs. Quang tucked the thick cloth he'd brought into a crack near the window. The cold draft stopped. Linda blinked. You brought that for my house? For you, Quang corrected. Your house is just where you are. Linda forced a scoff. You talk like a drama. Then tell me to stop, he said. Linda couldn't. They carried bowls to the table. The food was simple. Hot soup, vegetables, eggs. But in the stovelight, it looked like enough. Quang tasted the soup, then nodded with seriousness. Approved. Linda finally smiled. It's not poisoned. Quang leaned in slightly. I'm not scared of your food. Then what are you scared of? Linda asked. Quang's expression softened. I'm scared you'll get used to being alone again. Silence settled. Linda stared at her hands. People like you come and go. Quang's voice was calm. I'm not here to pass through. Then why are you here? She whispered. He answered slowly. Because no one should stand in that cold by themselves. Linda's eyes stung. You're not responsible for me. Quang shook his head. I'm not claiming responsibility. I'm choosing you. Linda breathed out shakily. You say it so easily. It's not easy, Quang said. It's just clear. Her voice trembled. And if one day you leave? Quang looked at the jacket on her shoulders. Then I'll be the kind of man who tells you, and the kind of man who comes back. Quang's hand moved toward hers on the table, slowly, asking permission. He didn't touch. He waited. Linda's fingers twitched. Then she let her hand rest closer. Quang's thumb brushed her knuckles, light, careful. Linda's breath caught. Quang. I'm here. he said. A sharp sound snapped the moment. Outside, wood scraped. A soft tap, like a pebble against the wall. Linda froze. Quang's head lifted, his body turning alert. Another tap, closer to the window. Quang rose and moved to the curtain. He lifted it only a fraction. Linda whispered, "What is it?" Quang's eyes narrowed. A dim shape stood near the path, too tall to be an animal, too still to be a bush. A faint glint flickered, a phone screen, or a flashlight hidden in a palm. Quang dropped the curtain and turned to Linda. "Stay away from the window, now." Linda went pale. "Someone's watching us?" Quang didn't lie. "Yes." He guided her a step back. "Behind me." Outside, a footstep crunched the soil, closer than before. The bamboo rat began to scratch frantically. Then came a knock on the wooden door.
Xin chào mọi người.
Firm, certain,
Trong
as
tập
if the
này,
person already knew who was inside.
Linda và
Quang held Linda's
bà
gaze. "Whatever happens
Linda
next,"
và
he whispered,
Linda theo
"you
bà
don't face it
và
alone."
cậu cháu ra nương
The knock came
mía.
again, harder.
Dưới nắng sớm, bà vừa chặt mía vừa kể chuyện ngày xưa. Dậy chặt 3 hoặc 4 khúc cho đẹp để bán được giá. Đồng mía cao dần, 45 đồng trở thành hy vọng cho phiên chợ. Một cây mía đổ bất ngờ khiến cả nhóm kêu, rồi cười xòa vì kịp đỡ nhau. Chiều xuống, Linda buồn bã vì con rúi của mình đã biến mất. Nghi có kẻ trộm rình quanh nhà. CEO Quang ghé đến lắng nghe và trấn an và tự sửa chiếc camera cũ trong kho, kéo dây lắp trước sân nhà để bảo vệ cô. Đêm đến, Linda nấu cơm nếp cẩm mời anh ở lại ăn. Hai người trò chuyện lòng ấm lại. Quang kể áp lực công ty, camera nháy sáng, bóng lạ thoáng qua, và không biết Linda có sống sót qua được đêm nay không. Mọi người nếu thấy video hay, hãy cho mình một like, một subscribe. Cảm ơn mọi người nhé.